At a glamorous charity gala in New York City, renowned philanthropist Sarah Langston is publicly humiliated by cold-hearted billionaire Everett Monroe, who accuses her of not truly understanding the struggles of the poor. In front of the elite crowd, Monroe offers Sarah a brutal challenge. Live like the people she claims to help, stripped of her wealth and privilege, for 3 months. If she succeeds, he will donate a fortune to her cause. Determined to prove him wrong, Sarah accepts. But as she steps into a harsh new reality, menial jobs, dangerous neighborhoods, and the cruel indifference of the world she once thought she understood, she encounters Evelyn Carter, a struggling single mother, and her young son. When Sarah uncovers a devastating connection between Monroe and Evelyn's tragic past, she is faced with a choice: expose the truth and risk everything, or keep her promise and find a way to lift them both out of their despair. As Sarah's journey unfolds, she learns that Monroe's coldness hides a shocking secret, one that will force her to question everything she thought she knew about guilt, redemption, and the price of compassion. In a world where the lines between victim and villain blur, can Sarah save not just those she seeks to help, but her own soul? A gripping, emotional drama about privilege, sacrifice, and the cost of truly understanding another's pain. The air inside the ballroom sparkled with wealth and elegance. Glittering chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their golden light bouncing off crystal glasses and perfectly polished silverware. Sarah Langston stood at the podium, her soft smile disguising the nerves that tugged at her. As a prominent philanthropist, she was used to these events, but something about tonight felt different. Ladies and gentlemen, as many of you know, our mission is to provide sustainable support to those living in poverty. It's not just about writing checks. It's about, have you ever been poor, Sarah? A cold voice cut through her words, making the room fall silent. Sarah blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. The voice belonged to Everett Monroe, a man whose wealth made him both powerful and feared. His silver hair, slicked back, glistened under the ballroom lights. He stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, a slight smirk on his lips. The crowd watched with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. "Pardon?" Sarah asked, her voice steady though her heart raced. Monroe stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "I said, have you ever been poor? I mean truly poor. Not the I skipped lunch kind of poor, but the kind where you don't know where your next meal is coming from." The question hung in the air, thick and accusatory. Sarah hesitated. Yes, she had grown up in a working-class family, but she knew what he was implying. "I wasn't born into privilege, Mr. Monroe," she replied calmly, trying to keep her composure. "I understand the struggle." Monroe's smirk widened. "You understand? How charming. How very naive." The audience murmured. Sarah felt the heat rise in her cheeks. "Tell me, Sarah," Monroe continued, taking another step closer. "Do you think attending a few fundraisers and shaking hands with people in need gives you a real understanding of their struggles? Could you survive their lives without your wealth and connections?" Sarah's eyes narrowed. "I do more than attend fundraisers. I dedicate my life to—" "Then prove it," Monroe interrupted. "Live like them for 3 months. No money, no connections. If you can do it, I'll donate a fortune to your cause. But if you fail, well," he let the threat hang in the air. The crowd watched her, waiting. Sarah's heart pounded. Monroe's eyes, icy blue and unyielding, bore into her. She could feel the weight of their judgment. "I don't need to prove anything to you," Sarah replied, her voice sharp. Monroe leaned in slightly. "But perhaps you do. For yourself." Sarah slammed the door of her penthouse, her breaths uneven as the events of the night replayed in her mind. How dare he? How could Monroe humiliate her like that in front of everyone? She walked toward the large windows, the sprawling view of Central Park doing little to soothe her frayed nerves. She caught her reflection in the glass, her dark brown hair neatly styled, her tailored dress perfectly fitted. The image was a far cry from the girl she had once been, growing up in a small apartment where every penny was stretched. But Monroe's words had struck a chord, hadn't they? The question gnawed at her. Could she do it? Could she survive without her wealth? Would she still be the same person without the safety net of her fortune? Her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from one of her close friends, offering support. Everyone was talking about the gala, no doubt. People would expect her to brush it off, to continue her charitable work unbothered. But the truth was, Monroe had touched a nerve. If I don't do this, people will think I'm just a hypocrite, she muttered to herself, pacing the length of her kitchen. But why should I? Who is he to question me? She stopped and looked out at the city again, this time not seeing the glittering lights, but the faces of the people she claimed to help, the ones who lived day to day, uncertain of tomorrow. I'll show him, she whispered, her hands trembling. I'll show him what real empathy looks like. The next morning, Sarah walked into Monroe's office, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The vast space was cold and unwelcoming, much like the man sitting behind the large mahogany desk. Everett Monroe barely looked up as she entered. "You're here," he said without surprise, his voice smooth and controlled. "I expected as much." Sarah stood tall. "I'm here to accept your challenge." Monroe raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by her resolve. He gestured to the chair in front of his desk, but Sarah remained standing. "Let's get the terms clear," she said firmly. 3 months. No money, no help from my contacts. I live like the people I serve. And when I succeed, you'll donate to my foundation. Monroe smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Correct. But let me be clear, Sarah. This isn't going to be a summer camp. You'll work minimum wage jobs. You'll live in places you'd never set foot in now. Are you sure you're up for it?" "Try me," Sarah shot back. Monroe leaned back, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest of his chair. "Very well. We'll see if you can walk the walk." The apartment was worse than Sarah expected. The paint was peeling, and the stench of mold hit her as soon as she opened the door. She set her suitcase on the creaky floor, the wheels making a loud scraping sound. She looked around at the grim surroundings, a small kitchenette, a broken window with a view of a dirty alley, and a couch that had seen better days. This was her life for the next 3 months. No more pristine penthouse overlooking Central Park. No more catered meals or fine wines. She dropped onto the couch, staring up at the ceiling. How did people live like this? Every part of her wanted to get up and leave, but she knew she couldn't. She was determined to prove Monroe, and maybe herself, wrong. She rose and opened her suitcase, pulling out a few clothes she'd purchased at a thrift store earlier. As she hung them up in the tiny closet, she heard a knock at the door. She hesitated for a moment before opening it to reveal a middle-aged woman holding a plate of cookies. "Hi, I'm Martha. I live next door. Saw you move in today," she said with a warm smile. "Figured you could use some neighborly hospitality." Sarah blinked, not used to such gestures from strangers. "Oh, thank you. That's really kind." Martha smiled wider. "Not much, but it's something." As the door closed behind her, Sarah stared at the cookies, wondering if kindness like that was rare here, or if the wealthy were the ones who had lost it. The smell of grease and burnt coffee filled the small diner as Sarah rushed inside, 5 minutes late for her interview. She'd overslept and used to the noise of her new apartment building. A man with a grizzled beard stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag that looked more like it was spreading the dirt than cleaning it. His eyes flicked up at Sarah. "Langston?" he grunted. "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied, trying to steady her breath. "I'm sorry I'm late. The bus was." "Save it," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "You want a job, or what?" Sarah blinked, taken aback by his directness. "Yes, I'm here to work hard." "Great." He cut her off again. "You start now. Grab an apron and get to it." Before she could protest, a dirty apron was shoved into her hands. Within minutes, Sarah found herself bussing tables, the weight of the trays heavier than she expected, her hands slipping as she tried to balance dishes. "Move faster," the manager barked from behind the counter. "We don't got all day." By the end of her shift, Sarah's muscles ached, her feet throbbed, and her head was spinning. As she collapsed onto the nearest empty chair, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. But quitting wasn't an option. Not yet. Sarah's second day at the diner felt worse than the first. Her body ached from head to toe, and the chaos of the small, grimy restaurant overwhelmed her senses. The clatter of plates and the sizzling sounds from the kitchen merged with the constant chatter of the customers, creating a noisy, disorienting buzz. "Langston, what are you doing standing around? Tables won't clean themselves." Pete, her surly boss, snapped from behind the counter. Sarah flinched and quickly grabbed a rag to wipe down the tables. Her hands trembled from exhaustion, and the smell of greasy food clung to her clothes. She had never imagined working in such a place. As she cleaned, one of the waitresses, a woman named Carla, sidled up next to her. "You look like you've never worked a day in your life," Carla said, not unkindly but with a smirk. Sarah shot her a tired smile. "That obvious, huh?" Carla laughed. "Honey, you stick out like a sore thumb around here. But keep your head down, do your job, and Pete won't fire you. He's rough, but he's fair." "I'll keep that in mind," Sarah replied, wiping sweat from her brow. But even as she tried to focus on the task at hand, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was out of her depth. She felt the judgment of everyone around her, but what stung more was the realization that she might not be able to live up to this challenge. The pride that had brought her here now seemed like a distant memory. Later that afternoon, as the lunch rush slowed, Sarah noticed a woman sitting alone at one of the corner tables. She looked tired, her clothes worn but clean. Her blonde hair was pulled back loosely, and she kept nervously checking her wallet. Sarah approached the table with a forced smile. "Hi, can I get you anything?" The woman glanced up, her pale green eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "Just a coffee, please," she said quietly, her voice thin. She hesitated before adding, "And maybe some toast, if that's not too much." Sarah's heart sank as she watched the woman nervously count her change. She could tell this woman was struggling, and it struck her with the realization that she was meeting someone who might have been one of the people she had claimed to help from her privileged distance. "I'll bring that right out," Sarah said softly, heading back to the counter. As she placed the order, Sarah found herself staring at the woman from afar. Something about her demeanor, the way she held herself, felt familiar. The quiet struggle she was witnessing wasn't so different from the lives of people she'd read about in reports and case studies, yet seeing it in person was jarring. When she brought the coffee and toast back to the table, Sarah hesitated. "You doing okay?" she asked gently. The woman looked up, clearly surprised by Sarah's kindness. It's been hard," she admitted, looking down at her coffee. "But you make do." Sarah nodded, sitting down across from her. "I'm Sarah. What's your name?" "Evelyn," the woman replied, her voice quiet. "Thanks for the coffee." As Sarah listened, Evelyn opened up in a way that took both of them by surprise. "I used to have a pretty good life," Evelyn began, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "My husband, Ben, worked for a big company. We had a house, plans for the future. But things fell apart quickly." "What happened?" Sarah asked gently, her stomach nodding. "Ben, he lost his job after they downsized. It crushed him. We lost the house. He tried to get another job, but he just couldn't pull himself out of that dark place." Evelyn paused, blinking away tears. He ended his life, and I've been trying to pick up the pieces ever since." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The pain in Evelyn's voice was palpable, and it cut Sarah deeply. She was no stranger to stories of loss and hardship, but hearing it from someone sitting right in front of her made it feel more real than ever. "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered, reaching across the table to touch Evelyn's hand. That's awful." Evelyn nodded. "The worst part is, the company that let him go, it was Monroe's. They treated him like he was disposable. I hate him for it." Sarah's heart stopped. "Monroe? As in Everett Monroe?" Evelyn's eyes flashed with recognition. "Yeah, that's the one. Do you know him?" Sarah nodded, her mouth dry. She suddenly felt exposed, her connection to Monroe more sinister than ever. I've crossed paths with him," she said carefully, her mind racing with what she had just learned. After her shift ended, Sarah offered to walk Evelyn home. The streets were dark and narrow, lined with crumbling buildings and littered with trash. Sarah could feel the weight of the neighborhood's hardship with every step. "You don't have to walk me," Evelyn said, though her tone was more grateful than dismissive. "It's not the best area, but I've learned to handle it." "I don't mind," Sarah replied, trying to absorb the sights and sounds of the world Evelyn lived in every day. It was a stark contrast to her previous life, and it filled her with a sense of guilt she hadn't expected. They walked in silence for a while before Evelyn spoke again. "I've been doing this on my own for years now," she admitted. "Raising Isaac, trying to make ends meet. There are days when it feels like I'm just surviving." "You shouldn't have to do it alone," Sarah said softly. Evelyn shrugged. "It's what we do. The system doesn't make it easy for people like me. No one's coming to save us." Sarah felt a surge of anger at the injustice of it all. "But that's not fair. There has to be a way to change things." Evelyn laughed bitterly. "Change? Sure. If you're rich like Monroe, maybe you can change the world. But for people like us, we're stuck." As they approached a small, dilapidated apartment building, Evelyn stopped. "This is me," she said with a sigh. "Thanks for walking me." "Anytime," Sarah replied, her heart heavy. "And if you need anything, I'm here." Evelyn nodded, offering Sarah a tired smile before disappearing into the building. As Sarah turned to leave, she felt a new sense of purpose stirring within her. This challenge wasn't just about proving something to Monroe anymore. It was about understanding the true struggles of people like Evelyn, and that meant she couldn't fail. The next day, after her shift, Sarah found herself standing outside Evelyn's apartment door. She had spent the entire day thinking about the woman and her son, Isaac, and couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do more. She knocked, and a moment later, Evelyn opened the door, her expression surprised but warm. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to check on you," Sarah said, holding up a small bag of groceries. "I thought maybe I could help a little." Evelyn blinked, clearly taken aback by the gesture. "You didn't have to do that," she said, stepping aside to let Sarah in. The apartment was cramped and worn, with mismatched furniture and peeling wallpaper. Despite the disrepair, it was meticulously clean, and Sarah could see traces of love and care in every corner. Isaac's drawings taped to the fridge, a few family photos on the wall. "It's not much, but it's home," Evelyn said, her voice filled with a quiet pride. Sarah smiled. "It's more than enough." As they sat down, Isaac came into the room, his eyes wide with curiosity. He was a bright, cheerful boy, despite the hardships he had clearly faced. Sarah felt a pang of sadness as she watched him interact with Evelyn, seeing the innocence in his eyes that had yet to be tarnished by the struggles of the world. "You're really good with him," Sarah said softly, watching Evelyn comfort Isaac. "I have to be," Evelyn replied. "He's all I've got." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with admiration for this woman who had endured so much but continued to fight for her child. In that moment, Sarah knew she had to do more than just survive this challenge. She had to use her experience to make a real difference, for Evelyn, for Isaac, and for others like them. As she left the apartment that evening, Sarah felt a renewed sense of responsibility settle over her. This challenge wasn't just about her anymore. It was about them, and she couldn't let them down. Sarah woke up with a heaviness that she couldn't shake. The thin walls of her apartment let in every sound from the street below, the blaring horns, the chatter of early risers, and the occasional shout from someone stumbling home too late. Each noise felt like a reminder of how far she had fallen from her previous life. She sat up in bed, rubbing her temples, trying to will away the exhaustion that clung to her. Dragging herself to the bathroom, Sarah stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, and her once neat hair hung limply around her face. She splashed water on her face and sighed deeply. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself, gripping the edge of the sink. The doubts were starting to creep in more frequently. She had taken Monroe's challenge to prove something, not just to him, but to herself. But now, the weight of it was becoming unbearable. The reality of living paycheck to paycheck, of constantly being tired and overlooked, had begun to sink in. Could she really make it through the next few months? That question lingered in her mind as she got dressed for another long shift at the diner. The walk to work felt longer than usual, and by the time she arrived, the dread had settled deep in her chest. She wasn't sure how much more of this she could take. It was well past midnight when Sarah's phone rang. She had just fallen into bed after a grueling day at the diner, her muscles aching in ways she hadn't known they could. The shrill ringtone pierced the silence, jolting her awake. "Hello," she answered groggily. "Sarah?" Evelyn's voice was shaky, barely controlled. "It's Isaac. He's burning up, and I can't get his fever down. I don't know what to do. I can't afford to take him to the hospital." Instantly alert, Sarah sat up, her heart racing. "I'm coming. I'll be there soon." She threw on the nearest clothes and rushed out the door, her exhaustion forgotten. The streets were eerily quiet as she hurried toward Evelyn's apartment, her mind racing. Isaac was just a kid, and the thought of him suffering because his mother couldn't afford basic health care made Sarah's blood boil. When she arrived, Evelyn was waiting at the door, her face pale and lined with worry. "Thank God you're here," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do. He's getting worse." Sarah stepped inside, her eyes falling on Isaac, who was lying on the couch, drenched in sweat. His breathing was shallow, and his skin burned to the touch. "We have to get him to a doctor," Sarah said, her voice firm. "I can't," Evelyn whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I don't have the money. The clinic's closed, and the hospital bills will." "I don't care about the bills," Sarah interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll figure that out later. Right now, we need to get Isaac help." Without another word, Sarah helped Evelyn bundle Isaac into a coat, and they rushed to the nearest hospital. As they sat in the waiting room, the weight of the system's failures pressed down on Sarah like never before. This was the reality that Evelyn and people like her faced every day, choosing between their health and financial ruin. It was a choice Sarah had never had to make, and it left a bitter taste in her mouth. The next morning, after making sure Isaac was stable and getting the care he needed, Sarah's anger bubbled over. It wasn't just about Isaac, or even Evelyn. It was about the broken system that let people like them fall through the cracks. And at the heart of that system, Sarah couldn't shake the image of Everett Monroe. He was the one who had set this challenge in motion, and now she needed answers. She stormed into Monroe's office without bothering to make an appointment. His assistant barely had time to register her presence before she pushed through the doors and found him sitting behind his massive desk, as calm and collected as ever. "Sarah," Monroe greeted her, his tone annoyingly pleasant. "What a surprise." "You need to explain something to me," Sarah snapped, her voice trembling with anger. "Last night, I spent hours in the hospital with a little boy who couldn't get basic medical care because his mother couldn't afford it. A mother whose husband worked for your company until he lost his job." Monroe didn't flinch, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. "And what exactly do you expect me to say?" "I expect you to care," Sarah shot back. "These are people's lives we're talking about, Everett. People like Evelyn, who have lost everything because of decisions you made." Monroe leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You think I don't know that?" he said quietly. "You think I don't live with that every day?" Sarah froze, taken aback by his sudden shift in tone. Monroe sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "You came into this challenge thinking I was the villain, and in many ways I am. But the truth is, Sarah, I gave you this challenge because I needed someone to see the damage I've caused. I needed someone like you to understand what's at stake." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For the first time, Sarah saw the cracks in his carefully constructed facade, the guilt that he had been carrying all along. After leaving Monroe's office, Sarah's mind raced with everything he had said. She hadn't expected him to admit guilt, hadn't expected to see the weight of his own actions etched into his face. But that didn't change the fact that Evelyn and Isaac still needed help. And Sarah couldn't wait for Monroe to have a full change of heart. She needed to act now. Back at the diner, Sarah sat with Carla during a rare lull in the rush. She had been mulling over ways to help Evelyn, but the challenge's restrictions made it difficult. "I need to find a way to help Evelyn," Sarah said, her voice heavy with determination. "But without breaking the rules of this stupid challenge." Carla raised an eyebrow. "Easier said than done. The system isn't exactly set up to help people like Evelyn. You're up against a lot." "I know, but I can't just sit back and watch her suffer. There's got to be something." Carla thought for a moment, then nodded. There's a shelter on the west side that offers job training and housing assistance. It's not perfect, but it could be a start. Sarah's heart leapt. That's exactly what I need. How do I get Evelyn connected? Go down there. Talk to the director. They'll listen if you explain the situation. Sarah nodded, hope flickering inside her for the first time in days. I'll do it. Later that evening, Sarah found herself back at Evelyn's apartment. Isaac was asleep, his fever finally broken, but the tension in the room was palpable. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this, Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. Every day feels like a battle I can't win. Sarah sat down across from her, her heart aching at the sight of her friend so defeated. You're not alone in this, Evelyn. I'm here for you, and we're going to get through this together. Evelyn shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. But how? You've got your own struggles, and Isaac, he's all I have. I can't afford to fail, but I feel like that's all I've been doing. Sarah reached across the table and took Evelyn's hands in hers. You haven't failed. You're doing the best you can in an impossible situation, and that's more than anyone could ask. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of Evelyn's pain hanging in the air. But Sarah refused to let it crush them. I found a shelter, she said softly. They can help with job training and housing. It's a start, Evelyn. It's not much, but it's something. Evelyn looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. You really think they can help? I know they can, Sarah replied, her voice steady, and I'll be with you every step of the way. Days after Evelyn's emotional breakdown, Sarah knew she couldn't stop at merely helping Evelyn and Isaac through their immediate crisis. She had to dig deeper. The pieces of Evelyn's story, especially the part about her husband's connection to Everett Monroe, gnawed at her. It felt like there was more to the puzzle, and Monroe had been too dismissive during their last confrontation. One evening, Sarah sat at her small kitchen table, laptop open in front of her. She began researching Monroe's company, scanning through news articles, public records, and business reviews. Most of the media painted him as a ruthless businessman, focused only on profit, with little care for the fallout. But then Sarah found it. An article about the layoffs several years ago that had devastated hundreds of families. Among the names mentioned in the report was Ben Carter, Evelyn's late husband. Sarah's heart sank. Ben had been one of Monroe's employees, one of many discarded in the wake of corporate downsizing. The article described how the layoffs had led to a wave of financial ruin for many of the workers. But there was something more. Rumors of a workplace accident that had been covered up just before the layoffs began. Could Monroe have known about this? I need to know the full truth, Sarah whispered to herself, her fingers tightening around her coffee mug. She jotted down a few key contacts from the article, people who might know more. It was time to go deeper. The next day, Sarah made her way to Evelyn's apartment, feeling the weight of her discovery pressing on her. Evelyn deserved to know the truth about Ben's employer. But how could Sarah reveal it without hurting her more? Evelyn answered the door with a tired smile, though her eyes still held traces of the stress she'd been carrying. Isaac was at the community center, giving them a rare moment of quiet. Come in, Evelyn said, stepping aside to let Sarah enter. Once they were seated at the small kitchen table, Sarah took a deep breath, unsure of how to begin. Evelyn, there's something I need to tell you. It's about Ben and Monroe. Evelyn's face paled slightly, but she nodded, waiting. I've been looking into Monroe's company, and I found out that Ben wasn't just laid off. There was a workplace incident before the layoffs. It looks like the company might have covered it up to avoid paying compensation, Sarah explained, her voice careful. Evelyn's hands tightened around her mug, her knuckles turning white. What are you saying, Sarah? That Monroe knew? That he let all of this happen, knowing it would ruin us? I don't know for sure, but it's possible. Sarah's voice softened. I didn't want to tell you until I was certain, but I felt like you deserved to know. Evelyn stood abruptly, pacing the small space of her kitchen. So, this whole time, everything that happened to Ben, it wasn't just bad luck. It was his company. It was Monroe. Her voice cracked with anger and grief. Sarah stood too, her heart breaking for her friend. Evelyn, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to hurt you. But I thought you needed to know the truth. Evelyn turned to face her, tears brimming in her eyes. You should have told me sooner, Sarah. Why didn't you say something? I didn't want to make things worse. I didn't know how to tell you, Sarah admitted, guilt tightening in her chest. Evelyn shook her head, her voice trembling. I trusted you, Sarah. I thought you were different. But you're just like him, keeping secrets, deciding what's best for me without asking. Sarah stood there, her chest heavy with guilt, watching as the trust she had built with Evelyn began to crumble. The confrontation with Evelyn weighed heavily on Sarah's mind as she made her way to Monroe's office once again. This time, she was armed with more than anger. She had facts. She needed answers, and she wasn't leaving until she got them. Monroe looked up from his desk as she entered, a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, crossing his features. You're back, he said, though his voice lacked the smugness it usually carried. I know about the layoffs, Sarah said bluntly, and the accident. I know you covered it up. Monroe's face tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he didn't deny it. It was a long time ago, Sarah. That doesn't make it any less wrong, Sarah snapped. People's lives were destroyed. Evelyn's life was destroyed. Her husband is dead because of what happened at your company. Monroe leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. You think I don't know that? You think I don't carry that guilt every day? I tried to fix it, Sarah. But by the time I realized the damage, it was too late. The cover-up wasn't my choice. It was my father's. But when I took over, I didn't stop it. Sarah blinked, stunned by his admission. Why didn't you do anything? Monroe looked up, his eyes filled with a weariness she hadn't seen before. Because I was afraid. Afraid of losing everything, of admitting how much harm I had caused. But I've been living with that guilt ever since. That's why I pushed you into this challenge. I wanted you to see the world I helped destroy, to make you hold me accountable for what I've done. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had come here expecting deflection, excuses, but Monroe was admitting his guilt. He wasn't the heartless villain she had painted him to be. He was broken, too. Sarah walked out of Monroe's office, her mind spinning with everything he had confessed. She had expected him to be the cold, ruthless man she had always seen in public, but behind that exterior was someone tormented by his own decisions. Now, standing on the busy sidewalk, Sarah wrestled with her next move. She had the information to expose Monroe, to ruin him publicly and finally bring justice for people like Evelyn. But would it really fix anything? Would taking Monroe down help Evelyn and Isaac, or would it just leave another family in ruins? That night, Sarah sat alone in her cramped apartment, staring at the evidence she had gathered. The power she held in her hands was undeniable, but as she looked at the faces of Evelyn and Isaac in her mind, she realized something important. Destroying Monroe wouldn't change the system that had allowed this to happen. It would just be another story of one man's fall from grace. She had to make a choice. Use this information to seek revenge, or find a way to help Evelyn and others like her without tearing everything apart. The next morning, Sarah knocked on Evelyn's door, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. When Evelyn answered, her expression was guarded, the hurt from their last conversation still fresh. I came to apologize, Sarah said softly. You were right. I should have told you everything sooner. I was trying to protect you, but that wasn't my decision to make. Evelyn crossed her arms, her gaze still wary. Why are you here now, Sarah? What do you want? I want to help, Sarah replied. Not just to fix what happened, but to make things right. I've spoken to Monroe, and there's more to this story than we thought. But I don't want to use what I know to tear him down. I want to use it to help you and Isaac. Evelyn's face softened, though she still looked uncertain. I don't know if I can trust you again. Sarah nodded. I understand, but I'm asking for a chance to prove that I'm here for you. No more secrets. For a long moment, Evelyn didn't say anything. Then, finally, she stepped aside, letting Sarah in. We'll see, Evelyn said quietly, sitting down at the table. But I'm not making any promises. Sarah sat at the edge of the park, overlooking the city skyline. The weight of everything, Evelyn's pain, Monroe's guilt, and her own emotional burden, pressed on her, leaving her restless. Her phone buzzed with a text from Monroe. An unexpected message after days of silence. We need to talk. Come to my office tomorrow. The next day, Sarah entered Monroe's office with a sense of foreboding. His usual air of confidence was gone. Instead, Monroe looked tired. The lines on his face seemed deeper, his sharp blue eyes duller. "Thank you for coming," Monroe said, his voice softer than Sarah had ever heard. "I've been thinking a lot since our last conversation." Sarah crossed her arms, her voice cold. "Thinking about what? How many lives your decisions have destroyed?" Monroe winced but nodded. "Yes, about that. About everything." He paused, running a hand through his hair, then leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "I didn't give you this challenge to prove a point, Sarah. Not in the way you think. I gave it to you because I needed someone to expose me." Sarah blinked, thrown off by his admission. "What are you talking about?" Monroe sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "I've spent years burying the guilt. My father taught me that the world is about survival, about winning. I followed his footsteps, crushed anyone in my way. I told myself it was necessary, but the truth is, I've ruined lives. I've been too much of a coward to admit it." Sarah stared at him, speechless. This wasn't the cold, ruthless man she'd confronted before. This was a man who was haunted by his own choices. "So, why challenge me?" she asked, her voice softer now. Monroe looked down at his hands. "Because I thought you could do what I couldn't. You have the strength to face the truth and push for change. I've built an empire on the backs of people like Evelyn. I can't undo what I've done, but maybe you can help me make it right." Monroe's revelation left Sarah conflicted, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had already planned a community rally to raise awareness about families like Evelyn's, people trapped in a cycle of poverty because of broken systems. The community center was buzzing with activity. Volunteers set up tables, speakers adjusted microphones, and families from the neighborhood began trickling in. Sarah stood at the center of it all, a nervous energy coursing through her. As the crowd grew, Sarah took the stage. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked out at the faces before her. This was the moment she had been building toward. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I started this journey because I wanted to prove that empathy can transcend wealth. But along the way, I've learned that understanding isn't enough. We need action." She glanced over the crowd and spotted Monroe, standing quietly at the back, his face unreadable. "I've met families like Evelyn and Isaac, people who are fighting every day just to survive," Sarah continued. "They don't need our pity. They need our support, our commitment to real change." The crowd erupted into applause, and for a moment, Sarah felt a surge of hope. Monroe watched from a distance, his expression conflicted. After the rally, Sarah sat with Evelyn in the quiet of her apartment. Isaac was playing in the corner, his laughter a stark contrast to the heavy conversation Sarah and Evelyn had been having. "There's a charity that's willing to help you," Sarah said gently. "They can offer support, medical care for Isaac, and even help you find stable housing." Evelyn's hands rested on her lap, her fingers twisting together nervously. "I don't know, Sarah. I've been fighting for so long on my own. I don't want to feel like I'm taking charity." Sarah reached out, touching Evelyn's hand. "It's not charity, Evelyn. It's a chance for you and Isaac to start fresh. You've carried this burden for so long, and you deserve a break." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Maybe you're right. I just want Isaac to have a better life than this." "You're giving him that by accepting help," Sarah said softly. "You don't have to do it all alone." Evelyn wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. "Okay, I'll do it. For Isaac." 3 months. That was the agreement, and now Sarah stood at the end of it. She had completed Monroe's challenge, but the victory felt hollow. There were no celebrations, no grand moments of triumph, just the quiet understanding that her life had changed forever. Monroe invited her back to his office for one final meeting. When she arrived, he stood by the window, gazing out at the city. He didn't turn around as she entered. "You've done it," he said softly. "You completed the challenge." Sarah nodded, though he wasn't looking at her. "I did. But it's not about that anymore, is it?" Monroe finally turned to face her, his expression somber. "No, it's not. He walked over to his desk, picking up a check. As promised, here's the donation. I'll transfer it to your foundation. But Sarah, I know that won't be enough. Sarah stared at him for a moment, then shook her head. No, it won't. You can donate all the money you want, Everett, but that won't fix the system. That won't help people like Evelyn in the long run. Monroe's face tightened. What do you suggest, then? Sarah took a deep breath. I suggest that you use your power to create real change. It's not enough to throw money at problems. You need to change the way your company operates. Focus on ethical business practices. Treat your workers like human beings. If you really want redemption, that's where it starts. Monroe stared at her, his jaw tight. Then, slowly, he nodded. You're right. I've been thinking the same thing, but I don't know how to do it. Sarah's heart softened. Then let me help. Weeks later, the world seemed a little different. Monroe had announced new policies at his company, policies that focused on worker well-being, ethical practices, and transparency. It wasn't a complete overhaul, but it was a start. Evelyn's life had begun to improve, too. With Sarah's help, she had secured stable housing and medical care for Isaac. She had even started a new job with better hours, allowing her to spend more time with her son. As for Sarah, she stood at the edge of the city once again, looking out over the skyline with a sense of quiet satisfaction. This journey had changed her in ways she hadn't expected. The challenge had forced her to confront not just Monroe's sins, but her own privilege and the gaps in her understanding. Monroe had asked her to stay on as a consultant for his company to help guide it into a new era. Sarah had hesitated, torn between her independence and the opportunity to effect real change from within. In the end, she had agreed. But this time, it wasn't about proving anything. It was about creating a world where people like Evelyn didn't have to fight so hard to survive. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah smiled to herself. The challenge was over, but the real work had just begun. Monroe sat at the head of the large conference room table, a place where he had always felt in control. But today, his posture was different. His shoulders weren't squared with the usual confidence, and his gaze was focused more inward than outward. Sarah, seated across from him, could see the tension in his jaw as he scanned the documents laid before him. These weren't typical corporate reports. They were proposals for restructuring his company. And for the first time, they didn't focus on profit margins or expansion plans, but on the well-being of his employees. I've been going over these, Monroe said, his voice measured, and I realized that it's going to take more than just implementing policies. It's about changing the culture I've spent decades building. Sarah nodded, her own heart racing slightly. She had pushed for these changes, but seeing Monroe actually consider them seriously was still a shock. It won't be easy, she admitted, but you have to start somewhere. Monroe leaned back in his chair, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of uncertainty. How do you convince people to change when they've been taught that success is all about winning at any cost? Sarah smiled faintly, recognizing the vulnerability in his question. You don't convince them with words, Everett. You show them through actions. If you lead by example, they'll follow. He sat in silence for a moment, digesting her words. Finally, he nodded. I'm willing to try, but I'm going to need your help. I can't do this alone. Sarah had anticipated this moment, but the weight of his request hit her harder than she expected. It wasn't just about fixing one company. It was about changing the way Monroe approached everything. I'll help you, she said, her voice firm, but you have to commit to this. No half measures. Monroe met her gaze, and for the first time, Sarah saw genuine determination in his eyes. I'm all in. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table in her new apartment, the sound of Isaac laughing from the living room bringing a warmth to the space that had been missing for so long. The apartment wasn't grand, but it was theirs, clean, safe, and filled with the promise of a fresh start. Sarah sat across from her, sipping tea. The two women had grown closer over the past weeks, the tension and hurt from their earlier confrontation now replaced with a deep understanding. You look happier, Sarah observed with a smile. Evelyn laughed softly, running a hand through her hair. I am. It feels surreal, honestly. After everything that's happened, I didn't think it was possible to feel this way again. Isaac ran into the room, holding up a drawing of a robot he had sketched. "Look, Mom, I made this." Evelyn beamed, taking the paper from him. "It's amazing, Isaac. You're going to be an inventor one day. I just know it." Isaac grinned, his face lighting up with joy before he ran back to his toys. Evelyn's gaze followed him, her expression softening. "For the first time in years," Evelyn said, turning back to Sarah, "I feel like I can breathe, like I'm not just surviving anymore." Sarah's heart swelled with pride and relief. This was why she had pushed so hard, why she had refused to give up, even when the challenge seemed impossible. Evelyn's new job and stable home were the tangible results of their shared struggle. "You did this," Sarah said gently. "You made this happen. You were strong enough to take that step." Evelyn smiled, though her eyes shone with unshed tears. "I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me hope when I didn't have any left." After leaving Evelyn's apartment, Sarah found herself wandering back to her old neighborhood, the place where she had grown up, long before she had become the person she was now. The streets were still familiar, though the faces had changed. The buildings were older, more worn, but they still held the memories of her youth. She stood in front of her childhood home, the small, modest house that had once seemed like the whole world to her. She remembered the struggles her family had faced, the times when they had barely scraped by, and how determined she had been to rise above it all. But now, as she looked at the house, she realized that her journey had come full circle. She had spent so long trying to distance herself from her past, to prove that she had escaped the hardships of poverty. But this challenge had shown her that the real strength wasn't in escaping. It was in staying connected to those who were still fighting. Sarah sat down on the front steps, her mind turning over everything she had learned. She had always believed in the power of empathy, but living this challenge had deepened that belief. It had shown her that understanding the struggles of others wasn't enough. You had to be willing to step into their world, to share in their pain and fight alongside them. The woman she had become was different now. Stronger, yes, but also more compassionate. More willing to use her privilege not just to help from a distance, but to make real, lasting change. She stood, ready to face the future, knowing that her work had only just begun. Monroe paced back and forth in his office, visibly unsettled. Sarah watched him from across the room, waiting for him to speak. She had been expecting this conversation, but now that it was happening, the tension was palpable. "I've been thinking," Monroe finally said, stopping to look at her. "About everything. About the changes we're making at the company." Sarah nodded, unsure of where this was going. "And?" Monroe took a deep breath. "I want you to join the company, as a consultant, to help guide us through this transition." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting a proposal, but this was bigger than she had anticipated. "Everett," she began carefully, "I'm not sure that's the right move for me. My work has always been outside the corporate world." Monroe stepped closer, his voice urgent. "I need someone like you, Sarah. Someone who isn't afraid to challenge me, to keep me accountable. We're not just talking about policy changes here. We're talking about reshaping the entire culture of this company. I can't do that without you." Sarah hesitated, torn between her desire to maintain her independence and the opportunity to effect real, meaningful change from within. She had always operated on the outside, pushing for reform through advocacy and philanthropy. But now, Monroe was offering her a seat at the table, a chance to transform the company from the inside out. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steady. Monroe nodded, his expression hopeful. "That's all I ask." A few weeks later, Sarah stood at the entrance of Monroe Enterprises, watching as employees filed into the building. The atmosphere felt different now. There was a buzz of excitement in the air, a sense of optimism that hadn't been there before. The new policies were being implemented, and though it was early days, the company was already beginning to change. Sarah had made her decision. She had accepted Monroe's offer, but on her terms. She would be a consultant, guiding the company through its transformation, but she would also continue her work with the foundation. It was the balance she needed, a way to bridge the gap between the corporate world and the grassroots movements she had always championed. As she walked through the lobby, Monroe approached her, a small smile on his face. "Ready for the first day?" Sarah nodded, her own smile growing. Ready. They walked side by side toward the elevators, the weight of their past confrontations replaced with a sense of shared purpose. This is just the beginning, Monroe said as they stepped into the elevator. Sarah looked at him, her eyes bright with determination. I know, but it's a good start. As the elevator doors closed, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The challenge had tested her in ways she hadn't expected, but it had also given her the tools to make a real difference. And now, as she moved forward with Monroe and Evelyn by her side, she knew that together they could create a future where people didn't have to fight so hard just to survive. A new dawn had arrived, and with it, the promise of change.